Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's program on Russian oil in the far north, culture, companies, and climate, featuring today Dr. Doug Rogers, who will be joined today by his friend, Dr. Veli-Pekka Tekkunen. And we are so thrilled to finally be able to feature Dr. Rogers from Yale University. He was supposed to be here last year, but we all know a little pandemic got in the way. And so now we are doing something virtually with him. We couldn't wait any longer. And we're so thrilled that he brought a friend to join him in the discussion today. Both of these individuals have written some really fascinating books. We featured some of them during our pre-show slide deck. We'll show them again at the end. And hopefully you'll take the time to purchase the books and continue this conversation and the discussion and this topic later after today's program. Right now it's 27 degrees and it's snowing, big giant snowflakes here in Alaska. I hope the air is fresh and the water is clean wherever you are around in the world. Please do say hello to us in the chat room. Let us know where you're tuning in from around the world. If you have any questions, you can of course type them in the chat room and I will read them at the end during the Q&A. Also, if you would like to ask a question in person, we're going to try that out today. As you know, who've been to our programs in person, one of the magic is we let people ask their questions to the speakers unfiltered. So if you want to do that today, just let us know in the private message. You can send it to myself or our production technician, Siobhan Choi. Let us know you want to ask a question. We will put your screen on and have you do that on purpose. It'll be a lot of fun. Join us in the discussion. We welcome everyone to join us in the Q&A and at Alaska World Affairs Council programs. We are one of 95 councils around the United States, and we're so thrilled to be talking about topics that are important to all of us like today. If you're interested in joining a dynamic group of individuals, it's that time of year where the Alaska World Affairs Council is looking for new board members. If you're interested in helping propel us into the future, please reach out to me personally and we'll have a discussion about how to join the board of directors of the Alaska World Affairs Council. We'd love to have you part of the team. I'd also like to give a special shout out to all of our supporters and partners who make programs like today possible. You saw some of our supporters at the front, including the Juneau World Affairs Council, a great partner, and our brand new supporter and sponsor, Lori Colbert at Colbert Family Law, a wonderful woman and a wonderful practice. Thank you so much, Lori, for sponsoring the Alaska World Affairs Council, and it's great to see you here today. We just finished our World Quest competition for high school students. For those of you who are not familiar, teams of 4 participate on current events, foreign affairs, and the winning team gets to participate in the National World Affairs Council competition. And last year, our winning team was from Service High School. This year, it was a Mat-Su Valley sweep. They took first, second, and third. We had 7 different schools participating. The #1 winner came from Colony High School. They were followed by Wasilla High School, and right behind them was Mat-Su Tech with South High School right on their heels. So the top 3 teams this year will get to compete virtually in our national competition. We wish everyone in the Valley good luck. And all of you who are not in the Valley, we hope to see you next year. Try to give those guys a shot for the money. We have some great programs coming up. You saw some of them in our pre-program slide deck. Jason Scott Smith will be discussing income inequality during the pandemic, a widening gap. We also have speed mentoring coming up. And then from Lisbon, Portugal, we have Tora Christiansen talking about from Portugal to Norway, the future of oil and gas. And also in April, we have economist, columnist, and editor Adrian Wooldridge, who's going to be talking about the wake-up call, why the pandemic has exposed the weakness of the West and how to fix it. And then in May, we're rounding off our season with a program on water wars. Don't want to miss it, put it on your calendar. With that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to the esteemed David Ramser, former chair of the Alaska World Affairs Council Board of Directors and author of Melting the Ice Curtain, the extraordinary story of citizen diplomacy on the Russian Arctic frontier. And I'll be back during the Q&A. David, over to you.
Hi, Lisa, can you hear me okay? Great. I'm sure happy to be back with the Alaska World Affairs Council. And today's topic is certainly timely, given that Russia seems to be in the headlines just about every day, whether it's treatment of opposition figures, computer hacking of US federal agencies, or fears of Russia's militarization of the Arctic, Russia dominates America's foreign policy headaches like no other nation. Of course, for those of us from Alaska, Russia is personal. While we may not be able to see Russia from downtown Anchorage, it's just 55 miles across the Bering Sea. And as I documented in my book on Alaska-Russia relations, there's certainly a warm spot in the hearts of Russians and Alaskans for each other and for better relations. Today's program will focus on a vital part of Russia's economy, like Alaska's, its oil in the far north. Our primary speaker is Dr. Doug Rogers, a Yale University sociocultural anthropologist, and he will be joined by Dr. Veli-Pekka Tikkanen, a Finnish professor of energy and environmental policies. Professor Rogers is director of Yale's program in Russia, East European, and Eurasian studies. He focuses on political and economic anthropology, natural resources, especially oil, the anthropology of religion and ethics, historical anthropology, and socialist societies. He has done archival and ethnographic research in Russia since 1994, often in collaboration with scholars from Moscow and Perm near the Ural Mountains. Professor Rogers' research has led to 2 award-winning books, The Old Faith and the Russian Land, and The Depths of Russia, Oil, Power, and Culture After Socialism. And he's currently working on 2 Russian-related projects. The first is the history and current reverberations of petroleum science in the Soviet Union, US, and Europe. And the second is a study of history, theory, and practice of the Russian and Soviet corporation. Professor Rogers received his bachelor's from Middlebury College, a master's in social and cultural anthropology from Oxford, and a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Michigan. And Dr. Tikkanen is professor at the University of Helsinki, who specializes in energy and environmental policies, energy security, natural resources, political, societal, power, and culture in Russia. He has written more than 100 publications, done more than 100 media appearances, and is leader of several academic projects and a frequent participant in national and international conferences. And his 2019 book is The Energy of Russia, Hydrocarbon Culture and Climate Change. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Rogers and Dr. Veli-Pekka Tikkanen. So Professor Rogers, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction, for the invitation. It's one of the great regrets of my pandemic year not to have been able to actually make it to Alaska, where I have never been before, and this was going to be my chance. So now I have to come up with another way to get to Alaska. On the other hand, it's great to be able to do this conversation after all, and a special bonus to do it with my colleague Veli-Pekka, who I've learned from a great deal about all kinds of things in this complicated world of Russian oil and gas, stuff that I don't understand very well at all. Veli-Pekka often does. So I'm hopeful that between the 2 of us, we can give you a little tour and then answer some questions. We're each going to speak for about 15 minutes. My plan is to talk to you first a little bit about the culture and companies part of our title, and then Veli-Pekka will talk for a little while about companies and climate with a focus on ecology and environment and climate in the Russian North. And then we're both going to try to keep our remarks fairly short so that we open up a bunch of topics that you might be interested in, and then we'll see what we can do to answer your questions in the conversation. So I want in my 15 minutes to give you a sort of whirlwind tour of about 100 years of Russian-Soviet history as it relates to oil, picking out some key points, but with the overall goal of suggesting to you some ways in which when you encounter news or current events about oil in Russia, you have a little bit of context in which to put them, and to suggest to you that there are some ways in which Soviet and Russian oil are very different from what you might know in Alaska and in the United States and other places around the world, and in some ways, especially recently, not so different. And that can be a sort of useful lens for thinking about current events. As David mentioned, I am by training and inclination an anthropologist. The kind of work that I do is very much based on interviews and going places and talking to people and working in archives and seeing what's going around and seeing what's going on. So I don't have and don't specialize in top level economic or political kinds of configurations, but the kinds of things you get from understanding oil in a particular time and place can also be useful for framing some of these questions, or at least that's my hope. Most of my research has been done in the Perm region of the Russian Urals, which is an old oil producing region, something I'll talk about in a moment. It's pretty cold, but it is not really traditionally part of the Russian North. Maybe in the sort of northern tips of the Perm region and up from there. But nevertheless, I think some of the dynamics of oil and culture and companies and politics in this region can still be a little bit illustrative. And I want to do these 100 years or so in 3 chunks: the Soviet period, the 1990s, and then the Putin era. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I think are some of the key characteristics of each of those periods. Starting first with the Soviet period. This is the first oil well where oil was struck in 1929 in the Perm region. It was really, I think of it as the first Soviet oil, right? So the Soviet Union dates from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and its aftermath. Before that, there was oil in the Caucasus. In Baku was a center of world oil production, and that was transformed into a part of Soviet oil production. But the oil produced in the Perm region in the Urals was really the first Soviet oil. And I think Soviet and socialist oil is a category that's worth paying a little bit of attention to, because a lot of the heritage of what we see today comes out of that period. Of course, later on in the Soviet period, into the 50s and 60s, the time where there were big Alaskan oil discoveries, the center of focus of oil in the Soviet Union moves into Siberia from the Urals, from the Perm region. But there's a few points that I think are useful thinking about with respect to oil in the Soviet system, socialist oil, Soviet oil, and that it doesn't look like the kinds of oil contexts with which we are most familiar, those of us who have grown up and have experiences mostly in the capitalist world. The Soviet Union was one of the world's largest and most influential oil producers, but at the same time, it did not produce those phenomena that we are so accustomed to. There were no boom towns. There were no oil elites. There were no tight relationships between oil and money. And something approaching 70 years of that kind of a relationship is durable and has created a significant heritage for us to think about. Some of the reasons for this include the fact that the Soviet Union was not a market-based economy. Money didn't flow through it. Exchange didn't take place within it in the same ways that we are accustomed to. Instead, it was a centrally planned economy where heavy industry was at the top and all sorts of other industries fell into place below heavy industry. So following this kind of a structure of the economy, when oil was exported abroad and turned into money or even sold at home, none of that money ever made it back to the production sites. You didn't end up with boom towns. People who were producing oil were never the elite. They were never getting wealthy from their production because it was being shunted into the state-centered socialist planned economy, which privileged other sectors. Another aspect of this that's quite curious and became very important later on is that Soviet oil companies were not vertically integrated. You didn't have an organization of the economy that specified that oil companies were one thing. Oil production, oil distribution, oil refining were in entirely separate ministries. They were different places that all had to coordinate with each other at the level of central planning, but were not unified companies. This became a big issue in the 1990s when people started to try to put together oil companies that we might recognize. One of my favorite illustrations of the differences among these ministries and the different prestige they had was that in the Perm region, I was often told when I was talking to people that the head of the Communist Party had on his desk 10 telephones. Some of you who remember images of the Soviet Union might sort of recognize the genre of the Soviet Communist Party bureaucrat sitting at his desk with 10 telephones that would connect him to the leading industrial enterprises in the region. Not a single one of those telephones connected him to the oil industry. It was not a prestigious region. They connected him to defense and industrial, metallurgy, those kinds of factories. That's where the action was. If you think about the more general iconography and imagery of the Soviet period, it was the hammer and the sickle, not the oil well. Despite the fact that the Soviet Union was one of the world's largest oil producers. The Soviet Union is fascinating in that it was, in the context of the 20th century, one of the most influential and biggest producers of oil in the world, and export of that oil was central to the endurance of the Soviet state. But within the Soviet Union, the experience of it was very different. You didn't have boom towns, vertically integrated companies in oil elite, oil wealth, and in fact, oil workers and many of the people who worked in the oil industry were fairly low prestige workers in the overall Soviet hierarchy. That began to change in the 1990s, but not really to a significant extent until the 2000s. So let me move to my second little historical window, which is the 1990s. In 1991, the Soviet Union and the socialist system around it, that entire structure of central planning and the political and economic configurations that came with it, falls apart. You have an astonishingly weak central state. This allegedly powerful and certainly pretending as though it's powerful Soviet state disappears largely in the 1990s in the face of these processes of marketization and privatization. Two examples I often use are that some ways in which social scientists often define what a state does are that it controls money and it controls violence. By printing a currency and controlling the currency that circulates within its territory, and by sort of having a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, by controlling a police force. The Russian state had neither in the 1990s. Violence was run largely by mafias or gangs or other organized economic groups. And money was in many cases non-existent. People bartered, people came up with their own kinds of currencies. The Russian ruble was not a valued or central place of how the economy worked. So what was interesting about this period was that this is also the period of privatization. So from a socialist model of ownership, all of these giant oil companies, all of these giant oil ministries and other natural resource companies begin to be privatized. And there's a rush to grab ownership of these production fields. That's also needs to be seen in the context of that Soviet period, where these were not necessarily the most prestigious parts of the oil industry at all. And as a matter of fact, in the Perm region, where I spent most of my time, the most important part of the oil industry became the local refinery, because it was churning out this oil, was one of the only things they were producing that could be exported abroad for some money. Everybody needed oil and oil products. And so the circulation of oil products through this regional economy in the absence of a strong central state became very central to the regional identity of how people there survived the 1990s. And it's over the course of the 1990s that, that Russian businessmen cobbled together from all different sorts of pieces, the vertically integrated companies that we see today. In the Perm region, this is Lukoil. They would buy a little production area and a little distribution area and the refinery, and then they would have their own vertically integrated company. Vertically integrated oil companies of the sort that we know are really in Russia a child, a product of the 1990s. And in the absence of that central federal state, of that powerful state, it became really crucial to see for people in this Perm region to look to the oil company as a producer of not just oil, but as a savior of the local economy, because that oil was so needed. Those oil products and the refinery in particular were so needed by so many people. This created two things by the end of the 1990s. We call the Russian state very weak. Also enormous inequality. The oil barons and others, the oligarchs you've heard them called, are getting enormously wealthy. Anybody connected to the oil industry is getting very wealthy very quickly, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with that level of wealth. And it's in this context that Vladimir Putin becomes president. He's in 1999 appointed to that role by Boris Yeltsin. And one of his goals is to sort of re-centralize, regrow the Russian state from its weakness in the 1990s, in part by taking over many oil companies that had been privatized, in part by throwing out many of the Western companies that had come in to engage in production sharing agreements or other kinds of agreements for exploration. And in part by, and this is going to be key, saying to the companies, you're not here just to make money, you are here to support the development of Russia. And this tie between the oil industry and Russian development and Russian cultural identity emerges from the Putin era in the 2000s. As oil prices rise, as oil companies become more influential, as the Russian state says to the oligarchs and the companies, you must participate in local development if you want to continue to have your advantageous tax benefits, for instance, or your advantageous access to drilling rights and things like this. So this happens first, at least in the Perm region, this happens at the regional level. Lukoil remained private. It was not nationalized like some other Russian companies. But I'll just show you some of the ways in which very quickly in the 2000s, the oil company became invested in what we sometimes see as corporate social responsibility. Other times gets called cultural citizenship or development work. They start handing out lots of grants for local and community development, for religion, for youth, for environment, for ecology. This is just a little picture that compares on the left-hand side, the oil deposits in the Perm region. They're in orange down the middle of this region. And on the right-hand side, where the company was spending money on cultural development. So culture and oil start to line up here in a way that they never did in the Soviet period. And those white areas that you see on the map on the far left and far right, basically we're not getting state support for cultural production, whether that's museums or folklore ensembles or things. So oil companies in this region spending money on cultural development, a key early part, and then this eventually, as the Putin era goes on, as the oil boom of the 2000s extends, and the central Russian state regains control over the circulation of money and suddenly has a lot of money from oil wealth, this tie between Russian national identity and the oil and gas industry in particular, which was never the case in the Soviet period, becomes much stronger and begins to undergird some of these expectations about oil exploration in the Arctic, about Russia's role on the global stage, about Russian cultural identity and natural resources. So at least in the Perm region, this kind of stuff started with very local company projects and the developing of culture that way, and the recuperation of culture after the chaos and devastation of the 1990s, suddenly with an oil company in front in a way that it never was before. And then I think that sort of expands to a more Russian national level. So you get these close ties between oil, national identity, oil companies, and the state. That is a fairly recent cobbling together in Russia. It's a very powerful one, and it certainly undergirds a lot of what the Russian state and the Putin regime would like to project onto a world stage, but it is not an age-old phenomenon by any stretch. So that's my sort of 100-year quick tour of companies and culture. Note some of the ways in which I've wanted us to see this as quite different than what we've talked about, what we're familiar with in the United States or other capitalist contexts, particularly that Soviet past where you didn't have oil booms or oil money circulating the same way. And then some of the ways in which over the recent times, we tend to think of Russian oil companies as, or Russian oligarchs or the relationship with the state as this strange, exotic, toxic combination. That may be true in some ways, but it's also the case that oil companies being involved in social development, corporate social responsibility, attempting to be good corporate citizens, and doing that through cultural production and cultural sponsorship and cultural projects, that's something that we're pretty familiar with in the capitalist world, and in that sense is not so far away from our experience. So I'm going to leave it at that to give you my little view of 100 years in 15 minutes about some of the ways in which we might place contemporary things that you might be encountering. And then I'll turn it over to Veli-Pekka, who's going to talk a little bit more about ecology, environment, and some of the more specific things that have been going on in the Russian North. So Veli-Pekka, the floor is yours. I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will start sharing mine. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and Doug, of course, for thinking of me. It's actually almost midnight here in Finland, so greetings from the other side of the globe, more or less. I've actually kind of tried to continue from where Doug left you. In a sense, Doug gave you the 100 years introduction into how oil, how energy and social development, or how oil and identity are intertwined. And my research focused on the last maybe 10, 20 years. And I try to look at this kind of energy identity and energy culture from the environmental perspective. So I'm actually introducing you, in a way, two major environmental problems that concern the Arctic that are intertwined with this energy culture identity that is being built at the moment in Russia and has been being built during the last 10 or 20 years. As Doug mentioned, it's a relatively new phenomenon in that sense. And then we also take a look at how actually that is, the culture itself is kind of doesn't make it possible to make these environmental issues better, and also not to confront the climate change issue, especially in the Arctic. And if we take a look at the first problem, which is related to the fact that Russia is one of the biggest oil producers in the world, about 12% of global, 13% of global oil comes from Russia. But actually, if you look at the environmental footprint or effects of that production, associated petroleum gas is a major environmental problem related to oil production globally. And if we look at Russian oil production, it's about 500 million tons per year that Russia produces. But if we compare how much Russia flares, which is a major environmental problem, because you are flaring the gas that is coming from the ground at the same time when you produce oil. About 10 to 20 billion cubic meters of gas is being flared in Russia yearly. And it's actually a very Arctic kind of production of that gas. And it affects the Arctic drastically. Actually, there are research articles that are claiming that actually up to a quarter of all Arctic actually warming during the climate crisis we have in our hands is due to only black carbon, that is the soot that is coming from the associated petroleum gas flaring in the Russian Arctic. So that is a major problem, and unfortunately this issue is not very well handled in Russia, and I'll come back to the reasons why that is so. The second problem is oil spills. Luckily, as with flaring, yes, the numbers and volumes are coming down. That's a good thing, but still approximately 10,000 oil spills take place in Russia. Again, Russia produces 13% of world's oil, but actually up to half of all oil spills take place in Russian territory. And again, this is an Arctic problem because very much of that oil, which is evaluated, it's about 5 million tons per year. 1% of Russia's oil production is actually released into the environment. And very big share of this ends up in Arctic rivers and in the Arctic Ocean. And again, the problem is that the infrastructure is old, but also the fact that these oil firms, energy companies in general, are not held accountable for these environmental offenses, basically what they're doing. And this is related, coming back to this energy culture and kind of the coil between oil and identity, that is related to the fact that, coming to this to my book and the concept I use, which is hydrocarbon culture, others use like petroculture, these kind of concepts. And the argument is that the high dependence on oil and gas in Putin's Russia today, and it's not only economic dependence, it's dependence that is related to power structures, that the energy sector and basically political structures in Russia are very much intertwined. And in order to maintain their power into the future, the regime is kind of forced to build this kind of hydrocarbon culture identity to be sold to the Russian people to legitimize or justify this very dependence that the regime is dependent on producing oil and gas. So what are the different then kind of effects of this hydrocarbon culture? There are 4 different kind of topical areas that I focus in my book, and today I will be discussing only about 2. And the first one is how the Arctic is being kind of sold as part of hydrocarbon culture to the Russian people. It is sold as the energy reserve of Russia that makes it possible for the Russia as a great power to expand into the future. So it's the direction where the great power can expand. And energy resources are very much central to this potential of territorial expansion of Russia. And this is the story that is told to the Russian people, and it is told in a sense that we need to protect those resources. We need to also militarily protect them so that other countries, other powers cannot reach our resources. We have to protect the Arctic because of that. And this is a domestic story. What the Russian state tells in the Arctic context to the outside world, it's a very different story. And this is very typical for this hydrocarbon culture. And it's actually all the 4 cases that I focus in my book. Actually, the same kind of dichotomy is very much visible, that the story told to the Russian people is very different, that Russia argues about these issues to the international audience. And the same is very much concerns the Arctic. And when Russia discusses about the Arctic, Arctic is being defined as a territory of cooperation and peace, not of confrontation and military power. And that's very central to understand how the Arctic is defined as part of the hydrocarbon culture. Then, of course, the issue of climate is a big issue. And unfortunately, part of this hydrocarbon culture, we can see that during the last decade or so, climate denialism is in the rise in Russia. And again, we have to remember that the way Russia discusses climate issues, also in the Arctic context actually, is very different again, how the climate issues discussed and sold to the Russian people, so to say. So within the Russian context, it's very much a denialistic narrative that is being produced in the Russian media, whereas when Russia discusses these issues in the international arenas and forums, it's very much arguing that we are responsible, we're part of the Paris Agreement and so forth. So it's again a very dualistic kind of discourse. And then coming back to these 2 major problems in the Arctic, that is the oil spills and the flaring. And kind of, if we think of those problems and how to alleviate and make them better situation in the Arctic, of course, important thing would be to challenge the overall hydrocarbon culture, because within the kind of hydrocarbon cultural mentality, those environmental problems are sort of taboos. They cannot be addressed properly because they are kind of challenging the whole logic of the Putin regime's enterprise that is clinging on to hydrocarbons. So that's kind of a problem that is also related and linked to us Europeans, who are mostly buying actually that oil and gas that Russia is producing. We have been also very, you could say, bad customers, environmentally speaking, because we haven't been able to kind of push forward standards and criteria how oil and gas is being produced. And this is our challenge in the future to, for example, the European Union Green Deal, package, for example, to push forward these kind of certificates and that kind of more responsible, environmentally more responsible kind of energy diplomacy that also concerns actually the Arctic very much. But I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
There I am. Well, thank you very much. And we have some people who want to ask some questions in person. So thank you everyone for agreeing to be part of this test to see if we can make this work. I have a lot of faith and confidence. And I'm going to call on our first person who you've seen several times during our in-person program, Dr. Paul Dunscombe. And he has offered and agreed to ask our first question. So Paul, I'm going to turn on your video. Here we go. Let's see if you pop up here. And Siobhan, if you can help me out if he's not popping up. There he is. So Dr. Dunscombe, there you go.
Unmuted.
Please ask a question.
Okay, so I've just in case I put it through in the Q&A section, and this is for both Dr. Rogers and Dr. Tikkanen. ConocoPhillips, which is one of our major producers here, used to run a series of ads, kind of public relations ads with the tagline, "We are all in the oil business." And it's a fascinating phenomenon just how persistent Alaskans' attachment to being a petrostate is, despite the turmoil of the last 7 years or so. And certainly one of the more surprising findings from Dr. Rogers' presentation is that Russia's career as a petrostate is actually so comparatively short, and yet it also seems to be quite deep. So, and I think Dr. Tikkanen also mentioned, talked about this. So I'd like you both to comment on how much is Russian identity these days tied up in being a petrostate?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, and I like very much the way you start this with the ConocoPhillips ad. I mean, when I teach a class called Culture, Power, Oil at Yale, and one of the things I try to get across early on is that, like, why is it that we only think that oil producers somewhere else in the world are petrostates? And why is it that we think in the United States, like Alaska and Louisiana and Texas count as petrostates and the rest of us don't? We're the ones driving we're all driving the cars, right? So it's not so easily sort of just put on the production side of things. So yeah, I mean, it's a key question is how tight is this identity and how recent is it? And I'll be curious to see what you say about this, Veli-Pekka. I mean, my sense is that the dependence of the Russian state on Russian foreign policy on oil and gas wealth, that's pretty well known, but everybody in Russia knows this, they're aware of it. Most people that I've talked to about it, whether it's elite or non-elite people, are not especially happy with this. I mean, they don't think that this is the greatest kind of way to organize a national identity. They're not happy that the economy depends on a small sector that enriches a certain sector of people. People who are tied into various kinds of Western intellectual or business or other cultures think that they would like to really have a much more diversified economy and participate in global trade on a lot of other kinds of ways and take care of a lot and make use of a lot of other capacities that Russians have. And of course, people at the sort of lower level of the economic spectrum want to know whether this oil wealth is going to trickle down to them ever. So it's a pretty contested identity in Russia, and it's pretty recent, and it's pretty, I don't see signs that it's as deeply rooted in Russian national identity stuff as, say, like that very close tie between Americans and cars and driving, and like that association between like getting your license in the United States and being able to drive and the freedom that comes with that, and a century's worth of music that is all built on this American identity of the open road in suburbia, and all that oil dependence, that petrostateness of American identity. I don't find that in quite the same way or in quite the same depth in Russia, precisely because this is more recently cobbled together and worried about at various levels of society, which isn't to say the state isn't really pushing this, but I'm not sure that it's quite so closely ingrained. What do you think, Veli-Pekka?
Well, actually, this is very good. I come to think of it, you're right, in a sense, if we think of petroculture as a whole, that's right. America is a better example in that sense, because actually you have both the production and consumption, whereas in Russia, it's, if I think of the commercials and how exactly this oil and gas and identity are being kind of coiled together in Russia today, it is via the kind of state identity that is related to production of that energy, and maybe selling it abroad. For example, Gazprom selling it via the Power Siberia pipeline. If you look at that commercial, it's very interesting. You know, it's all the kind of military is there, power is there, traditions is there, history is there. So in that sense, but yeah, right. I mean, it's very contradictory in a sense. If there was a poll a few years ago when Russians were asked whether they think that Russia is a energy superpower, 75% of Russians says, yes, we are an energy superpower. But at the same time, 75% of Russians, so clearly some of the same people are arguing that we are kind of banana republic. We are producing all the raw materials. So there's a contradiction here about the identity. But yes, you're right. The state is trying to build this identity. And my explanation is because it's the only economic model they can come up with now. And they have to kind of produce this culture to kind of push down the criticism towards this kind of economic model that Russia is leaning towards today. And you were talking about this trickle down. Yes, during the early 2000s, there was a big economic growth in Russia. But if you look at, for example, how economic wealth has been kind of being concentrated in Russia, it's 1% of population, 1.5 million people in Russia are actually owning three quarters of all wealth in Russia. And that's way beyond what the situation in the US or in China. So in that sense, I mean, it's really, I mean, also the protest what we see today in Russia, what we have been seeing during the last couple of weeks, I think it's very much related to this, that people, especially the younger generations, are really kind of tired because of the corruption that is very much linked to oil and gas, and the fact that it's very much concentrated.
I'm really excited about these questions coming in. They're coming in from all over the world. We have from the East Coast and from Scandinavia, and I'm going to have some of these people come on, ask in person, but I see one through the chat function that kind of follows up on this. So I want to read this one first. And so the question is, what becomes of the Russian hydrocarbon culture if the advent of electric vehicles should greatly lower demand for Russian oil?
Shall I answer, Doug?
Yes,
would
go.
you like?
No, go ahead.
Well, that's basically the idea of my book, that if Russia is not unable to renew its economy and invest in great magnitude into renewable energy, Russia is going to be, of course, probably much poorer, but also much more insecure country for its citizens, and also a more kind of troublemaker country in the international scene, because the regime that is losing its kind of money, kind of where the money comes from, and it is shrinking, then, and is not able to invest into other sectors of the economy, especially renewable energy, where the rest of the world is moving to that direction. Then, of course, I mean, I think it's going to be a more violent regime that we're going to see, and that really is not only an energy political or climate political issue, it's really a security political issue that we should really, we Europeans who are now buying Russia's energy, we should push energy transition in Russia.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that, Dr. Rogers?
No, I think that's the right. I mean, you know, where electric vehicles stand in the broader scheme of renewables, or is one of the questions. I mean, it's not just that Russian resources are powering cars, but they're heating much of Europe through the gas pipeline supply. So that's not directly influenced by electric vehicles. It may be influenced by other things, but there's a broad energy landscape out there that Russian hydrocarbons play some important, but in some places huge and in some places not huge roles. So where the changes to renewables will actually impact the Russian situation and where not is not a straightforward, easy question as far as I can see the larger picture.
Yeah, and actually it's related also to the fact that actually fossil gas is being probably contested as a kind of this kind of a fuel that makes it possible to switch to renewables. So that's really this political discussion in Europe at the moment, and of course there's a big discussion also how Europe could switch to hydrogen, and can actually Russian gas play some kind of role in kind of bridging that switch to hydrogen. So that's also important issue.
Okay, and now we have joining us from the East Coast, Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Graff. We miss you here in Alaska. It's so great to see you in person. Are you in a plane or in your car? We're so glad you're asking a question in person.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm sitting in the back seat of a car, but no, and so I'm on the road. But I'm very interested in this conversation, so I appreciate you having me on board. I appreciate it. But yeah, just the one question that I do have is with respect to economy, and then dovetailing that into geopolitical influence. So specifically, I know that hydrocarbons in the U.S. and specifically the oil shale industry has really turned the U.S. from a consumer and importer of oil to now achieving oil independence, and also potentially even being an oil exporter, and that happened in the late 90s and, certainly into the 2000s. And my understanding is that Putin has reacted sharply to this, and because it's affected his economy in the sense that now there's competition. I know, Dr. Tenneken, you mentioned 13%, or that Russia produces 13% of the world's oil. So to that extent, now with the United States being a major player on the scene and being much less of an oil importer, and now even being an oil exporter, how does that affect Russia's economy? And then to that extent, how does that affect its geopolitical influence? And this question goes to Dr. Rogers and also to Dr. Tenneken. Thank you.
Doug, want you to take it first?
No, other than to say it's an excellent question, and I think as far as I understand, the Russian state and Russian oil companies have really had their eye on the American increase in production over the past years, because, as you say, it's both competition, but it also is just increased hydrocarbons on the market that has the tendency to lower global prices. And because the Russian government is so dependent on the price of oil pegged to certain amounts for its general budget and its general spending, it is indeed something that the Russian government has worried about a great deal, and is, to my understanding, exploring various kinds of collaborations and various kinds of strategies that would, tilt or the global geopolitical balance here back further in the direction of Russia's kind of production. But it's not clear that that's going to be immediately successful, because it's such a complex, dynamic international system.
And I would like to stress that there's a big difference, of course, between oil and gas. Oil is a like commodity that is traded everywhere. You can ship it everywhere. So in that sense, it's a different thing. Of course, as you mentioned, Doug, it's about price. So in that sense, if there's more production, there's the risk of price and the link to Russian budget. That's clear. But then, of course, gas is a different kind of commodity, because it's linked to these pipelines, and Europe is kind of is married to Russian gas in that sense. And of course, if their market shares change, of course, that's kind of bigger challenge for Russia than when it comes to oil, I would say.
Okay, I'm going to read one of the questions here in our Q&A chat box before bringing someone else here online. And this is a question about what has happened to Exxon's exploration activities in Russia since their activities were stopped due to the U.S. foreign policy about 4 years ago.
I know
I
only
don't
that they
have.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Veli-Pekka. Jim. I don't
No.
have specific understandings of what's going on with Exxon. I will say that my impression is that the general relationship between Russian oil companies and international oil companies has switched from a sort of 1990s focus on production sharing agreements to Western firms providing technology and other kinds of oil services and oil field services agreements. So it's not maybe Exxon that's involved, but it's other smaller oil services companies that are collaborating in various ways on deep drilling or other kinds of things. So I think that there's not as much activity at the level of the major Western international oil companies at the moment.
Yes, and if of course it's linked to the war in Ukraine. After 2014, there are sanctions that actually address especially Arctic oil drilling technology, and that's the reason why, for example, ExxonMobil withdrew and was forced to withdraw from the Arctic offshore projects that it had with Russian partners after 2014.
Okay, thank you. Rasmus, you had a really great question in the Q&A, and thank you for turning on your camera. First of all, where are you joining us from? And then please restate your question to our speakers in person.
Yes, good evening. I'm sitting in a studio in the Norwegian Student House in Paris, where I'm on sabbatical. And my name is Rasmus Bertelsen. I'm a professor of Arctic International Relations at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, northern Norway. So it's extremely interesting to follow this discussion. Veli-Pekka and I have met. Doc Rogers, it's very interesting to listen to you. My approach to international relations, international political economy is more material than identity and cultural wise. I've also done research on the Middle East, on Persian Gulf countries. And I think I recognize many of the patterns you're talking about concerning post-Soviet Russia from Middle Eastern countries, from Persian Gulf countries. So basically, my question is whether these cultural variables, are they intermediary variables, and the true explanatory driver is resource curse? Because Doc Rogers, it was extremely interesting to hear about the Soviet oil history. Because I almost thought, I don't know if it's true, but I almost thought, did the Soviet Union, because of this command economy, avoid a natural resource curse? Because now, and what Veli-Pekka says, that Russia, post-Soviet legacy, has very strong strategic technology, nuclear, space, aeronautics, subsea, etc. But Russia seems to have like the Soviet Union, have great difficulty transforming this strategic technology into an innovative economy. And there, just like Persian Gulf states, post-Soviet Russia seems very, very stuck in a natural resource curse. And exactly what Veli-Pekka is saying, that regime survival depends, regime survival is dictated by this natural resource curse. And just like Mohammed bin Salman had Khashoggi murdered in the Saudi consulate general in Istanbul, the Kremlin will have to resort to whatever violence it needs to resort to stay in power. So basically, I mean, is it more about the resource curse than culture?
I think you cannot take them apart. Of course, there is the economic rationale behind, as you explained, and that's linked to the discussion on resource curse. But the means and the issues and phenomena I've been focusing on is more cultural, and try to understand it via geography also. How actually part of that resource curse is because of the specific geographies of oil and gas, that it makes it possible to maintain power in these petrostate or hydrocarbon culture contexts. But Doug, you want to continue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think in the general social science and international relations literature and scholarship, and to some extent public policy world, thinking about the resource curse, as you indicate, is the main is the main intellectual driver, and the claim there is that if you the greater your economy is dependent on the production of oil and revenues from oil, the more you are associated with underdevelopment, with violence, with a number of other kinds of regime types, and with all sorts of sort of bad outcomes. And there's a huge data set from around the world that people use to talk about this. And you know, I think it's from its own terms, it's a quite powerful kind of it's its own powerful kind of explanatory paradigm. My view is that it misses many things that we don't, that we would want to include in the analysis that make it not a very compelling way to talk about these issues for me as an anthropologist. One is that it focuses entirely on oil revenues and not the nature of the industry. It basically talks about what share of the budget is from oil revenues, but we would want to talk about a lot more than that money. And and thinking about the sort of culture and identity and material aspects that that we've been talking about here gives us a bigger lens through which to think about what's going on. For instance, you know, you wouldn't think about the resource curse in the context of some of the earlier conversation we were about having the United States as a petrostate. That wouldn't count because of the proportion of oil rents in the U.S. national economy. But as far as I'm concerned, given the amount of oil consumed in this country, we're a very close part of the petrostate economy in the United States. So I think there's a range of ways in which we would want other pieces of the picture to help flesh out what's going on, and that whether states act with respect to the size of the oil revenues in their budgets is a piece of this, but to try to account for the entire picture of the global energy scene. Some of the questions we see about renewables and LNG and links between international identity, and we're all living in oil. None of those things get captured in this literature on the oil curse, and I don't think that it's useful to reduce everything to that literature, although clearly it's central insight that if you have a federal government that relies on oil rents, it constrains some kinds of actions is a piece of the picture, but I've never found it a compelling full picture.
Yeah, and my example, I actually was in a Arab Emirates year ago, just before the Corona time, and then attended a conference, and I found this book on oil, which is actually energy culture in making in the Arab Emirates, which is something that you wouldn't probably find in US in that sense, that it's a kind of state-produced propaganda for kind of to think positively about oil. And this is what is kind of interests me, that how actually these Gulf petrostates and Russia, for example, what kind of things kind of are common there when you look at the energy culture. And actually coming to this energy transition issue, I think it's very, we tend to look at these kind of petrocultures in a very negative light, that everything is kind of bad. They look at climate issues from that, they try to be the climate denialistic and so forth. But actually we can learn from them, because if you think how cleverly and in very versatile ways they are making energy visible in society. And if you look at the European context, that's the problem. 75% of our energy is still fossil energy, but it's not visible anywhere. If you compare Finnish oil company Neste, their commercial, there's no reference to their business, how the oil comes from the ground and how actually it's being consumed in a society. They're looking into the future, but still they're selling oil. Still they're selling gas. Whereas in Russia, it's energy is visible. And this is something that we could learn in our energy poor context, how to make energy visible. And this is actually what we're doing now within my team. We have 13 scholars focusing on this energy transition perspective or energy culture, trying to learn from petrocultures how to make energy visible in our societies to hasten energy transition.
Rasmus, did you have a follow-up question to that?
There was an interesting question about ExxonMobil and what happened to their big involvement. I think it was with Rosneft in the Kara Sea. My impression, of course, ExxonMobil was forced out by sanctions, but I have the impression that many of the activities have been replaced by Chinese partners. And I think there was an assumption with these Ukraine-Crimea sanctions in 14 that Western technology could not be replaced. And but of course, I mean, the world adapts. And I have the impression that many perhaps Western seismic exploration ships in the Russian Barents Sea and the Kara Sea have been replaced by Chinese vessels. And of course, the long-term effect will probably be that even after sanctions, Western companies will never come back. But I was saying, I'm in Paris right now. One of the things I'm interested in here is that there's one Western company, energy company, which operates very successfully in Russia. And that's, of course, French Total, which maintains 20% in the Yamal project, and I think 10% in the Arctic LNG project. So one of my research questions is, okay, ExxonMobil is forced to leave the Kara Sea. What is it that makes it possible for Total to continue operating very successfully in Russia? So I just want to add that to that ExxonMobil discussion, but thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the answer is linked to the way financial sanctions are being introduced, and then of course the technological sanctions. I think that's the reason why Total can engage in those projects.
Unfortunately, the hour has just shot by. We are out of time. It's midnight there for you, Veli. Thank you both so much. Dr. Doug Rogers, Dr. Veli-Pekka Chinkinen, for joining us today in this discussion. It was very fascinating to hear. We hope to learn more through your books. We're going to show those here at the end of the slide deck. We want to thank everyone else for joining us today for this program and this interesting discussion. We hope to see you again. Go to our website at alaskaworldaffairs.org for more information. And if you have any comments or questions or suggestions for the Alaska World Affairs Council, for our programs, future speakers, or want to join our board, please let us know, reach out to us, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you again very much to our speakers.
Thank you, everybody. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.